Now it's the time to present our next speaker. Okay, so next speaker is John Halstead, who is talking about the greening of paganism. John was the principal facilitator of the pagan community statement on the environment. They're written for Patheos, Huffington Post, and Gods and Radical Press, and edited the anthology Godless Paganism, Voices of Non-Theistic Pagans. John is also co-founder of the first chapter of 350.org in Indiana. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, just need to...
So first of all, I just want to give thanks to the organizers of the conference, because I've noticed throughout the conference, and including this session, they've done an excellent job of grouping papers together. Crystal, I'm going to have to go back and edit my paper and include a reference to your study, because it's right in line with what I wanted to talk about. So many contemporary pagan traditions and groups do explicitly style themselves as nature religions or earth religions, and many individual pagans describe their spirituality as earth-centered or nature-centered. But the question of whether paganism is actually nature religion, I believe, is actually a complex one. And I think that complexity is often glossed over in academic descriptions of pagan beliefs and practices. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the outline of the history of paganism's claim to be a nature religion, because I believe it's well documented and oft repeated, and skip ahead to the critique of that claim. So even in the first decades of paganism's organization in the late 60s, early 70s, not all pagans understood paganism as a nature religion. For some, like Fritz Muntian, who's one of the founders of the new Reformed Order of the Golden Dawn, one of the three kind of first pagan organizations, paganism was not primarily a nature religion, but what he calls a hedonistic religion, one centered on an ethic of free and responsible self-expression. And that attitude continues today for many pagans. Nor were all early pagans environmentalists. In the first edition of Drawing Down the Moon, published in 1979 by Margot Adler, NPR correspondent and Wiccan priestess, she documented what she described as a worrying lack of political will among Neo-Pagans. And in the second edition of the book in 1986, she recorded one of the leaders of the Neo-Druidic movement, Isaac Bonowitz, saying that while many pagans were very concerned about environmental matters, most Neo-Pagans, quote, most Neo-Pagans are too loose and liberal to be fanatic about anything, including their own survival. And this kind of goes along with what Crystal was talking about. Neo-Pagans have inherited ritual forms and theologies from British traditional Wicca, which did not itself begin as a nature religion, but as an esoteric mystery cult. Wouter Hanegraaff has observed that Wicca is a Neo-Pagan development of traditional occultist ritual magic, but the latter movement is not itself pagan. And more recently, let me pull this up, Esme Partridge wrote in an article published just a few months ago, share the screen, Western occultism came hand in hand with the founding principle of the modern age, man's dominion over nature. And I've kept the gender-specific language here intentionally. Liberal capitalism and occultism are both fruits of the Enlightenment. Both place man at the very center of the universe, attempting to emancipate him from the constraints of tradition and the natural world itself. Both attempt to manipulate nature, be that with magic or brute force. And again, that's from Esme Partridge's article, Witchcraft Isn't Subversive. So the ritual and symbolic forms that resulted from the merger of occultism and paganism sometimes bear an ambiguous relationship to nature. So consider how Pagans living in myriad climatic zones may follow a universalist wheel of the year, which is derived from the climate of Great Britain, which may or may not correspond with local environmental conditions. Or consider the fact that for many years after in the formative years of the pagan movement, there was a discussion about whether pagans in the southern hemisphere should have to celebrate the beginning of winter during the summer solstice, which I think makes no sense at all, but the fact that there was a discussion is significant. Joe Pearson has observed that the pagan wheel of the year sometimes turns the seasons rather than the other way around. Likewise, when pagans invoke the elements, often in indoor settings, these often take the form of abstract Neoplatonic essences rather than the actual earth beneath our feet and the air and water flowing around us. The pagan ritualist Stephen Posch relates one instance, for example, which I think exemplifies this well. When he was with a pagan group performing a ritual and they invoked the element of water in the traditional cardinal direction of the west, while nearby the great Mississippi River flowed by unnoticed in the east. As a centerpiece of these pagan rituals, a pagan might undertake an imaginal journey to a grove, or other sacred natural site like Stonehenge to converse with spirits or deities without ever having to experience the inconveniences or harsher realities of the natural world, or appreciate directly the connection between their actions and their effect of those actions on the world. So Posch questions whether pagans, as we gather in our circles, are, quote, standing with our backs to the world, figuratively as well as literally. This raises the question what exactly the word nature means to pagans. In his study of the rise of paganism in America, Chas Clifton distinguishes what he calls cosmic nature from Gaian nature. The former, for Clifton, is symbolic nature. It's the value of which lies in the esoteric truths it holds for humanity, whereas Gaian nature is an embodied nature, which has its own intrinsic value apart from its usefulness to humans. I like to think of cosmic nature as Thoreau's nature and Gaian nature more as the nature of John Muir. So many pagans' conception of nature is located more on the cosmic end of the spectrum, with only a tenuous connection to Gaian nature or embodied nature. In other words, nature for many pagans is more of a social construct than a direct experience. A romanticized or idealized nature which serves as little more than a backdrop to esoteric rituals. Peg Alloy, who studies paganism in the media, seriously questions whether pagans have lived up to the challenges of environmentalism in her essay. Let me pull this up. Has pagan environmentalism failed? To which she answers yes. And her answer is quite poignant. There are now hundreds of thousands of people who identify as pagan or Wiccan or Druid who have never conducted a ritual out of doors, who have never attended a festival at a campground, who have never planted a garden in honor of the eternal return of the Earth Mother in spring. Do they discuss gods and their ritual practices and spells and theology? And I would add here, attend academic conferences? Sure, we do. But do we get our hands dirty in actual dirt? There have been and still are many pagans who are shining lights of sustainable living and environmental activism. Starhawk and the Drag Environmental Network are just a couple of the obvious examples that come to mind. There are many others. And yet, in some ways, the symbolic prominence of these examples may obscure a lack of ecological commitment among pagans at large. Anecdotal evidence suggests that there is a mismatch between the stories we pagans tell about ourselves and our actual level of ecological engagement. So Jonathan Woolley reported from the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris and contrasted the presence of other faith traditions to paganism's relative absence from the event. And his observations coincide quite a bit with my own. He notes that Christian churches have been very active in recent years in throwing their energies behind the climate movement, or at least some of them have. Other spiritual groups have done likewise, even when they lack central ecclesiastical institutions such as Islam, or when there's small communities that struggle to afford the cost of travel, as is the case for many indigenous communities. He goes on. Pagans, by contrast, have yet to engage in this organized fashion. Though we may be active participants as individuals, our organizations have shown a puzzling lack of initiative, failing to capitalize upon the almost unique relevance of our philosophies to climate change. Well, it's taken a seed change in Christian theology and a harnessing of long neglected but nonetheless orthodox parts of Christian thought to respond to this great challenge of our age. No such shift is necessary within the pagan religions. We share a common, compelling reverence for nature, either as the body of the goddess, an utterly animate cosmos, or the province of many deities. It should be the easiest thing in the world for us to take our place in spaces like COP and to command great power and respect when we do so, and yet this has not happened. There are several possible reasons for this. Perhaps the most obvious explanation is paganism's small numbers, relatively speaking, and the lack of organization or intentional disorganization. However, as Woolley points out, the lack of centralized institutions does not prevent other faith communities from organizing, a conspicuous example being indigenous peoples. And in the age of social media, a lack of formal institutions is not the barrier to organizing that it used to be. Other factors probably include many pagans' suspicion of interfaith communities, justified or not, and their ambivalence toward the politicization of religion as they perceive it. Another possible explanation, one external to paganism, is that pagans might be discouraged, either implicitly or explicitly, from joining environmental actions by secular activists or other faith groups who are concerned that association with paganism may damage their credibility. Considering how environmentalism is often slurred with the epithet pagan by some political conservatives, this concern is probably justified. But it's also possible that even more liberal monotheists and secularists also, who are sympathetic to Earth stewardship, might be put off by any kind of association with contemporary paganism. So this suggests to me that we pagans have more work to do, not just in the area of environmental activism, but also in the area of interfaith. Now, because of the courage and dedication and frankly sacrifices of many pagans before me, working over a period of decades, many people no longer see paganism as something to be feared or as something threatening. Unfortunately, many do continue to see it as something to be ridiculed or at least something to be dismissed. And I think one way that pagans might increase our credibility with the interfaith community would be for us to find ways to speak with harmonious voices on the critical issues of our day, like climate change. While many pagans are no stranger to political action, the effectiveness of our actions may sometimes be diminished by the cacophony of our diverse voices. And if we could find a way to join our voices in protest in a similar way that we join our bodies and our spirits in ritual, then our actions would carry that much more weight, I believe. We might appreciate that speaking in harmony does not mean we have to all be of one mind or agree on every point. We often speak of attuning ourselves to nature and the cycles of the earth, and I think likewise we need to strive to attune ourselves to one another better, temporarily setting aside our egos and prioritizing our individual disagreements when a collective voice is urgently needed, as it is right now. If there's any issue in which pagans should be able to speak harmoniously, it's in response to the desecration of the environment. So it was in response to this perceived need for more a unified voice that led to the creation of a pagan community statement on the environment. The statement was written over a period of 6 months, ultimately by about 40 individuals, and it concludes with a pledge to individual and collective action. So that is what people are doing when they sign it, is making that pledge. After a period of public comments and revisions in response to those comments, the statement was published in its final form on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2015. We have received signatures from about 100 countries, people in about 100 countries, and the statement's been translated into 16 languages. Virtually every prominent pagan organization has signed the statement as well. And you can see a list of those organizations, and the process, history of the process by which the statement was written, which I think is kind of interesting in itself, at the site ecopagan.com. To date, the statement has collected just under 10,000 signatures. And frankly, that number appears insignificant in contrast to the estimated number of pagans in the world at over 1 million. However, the statement, the Pagan Community Statement on the Environment, remains the single most successful attempt to organize pagans to speak with a single voice on any matter to date. That being said, there was opposition to the statement from within the pagan community. Though we often speak of paganism as a monolithic thing, it's actually helpful to consider it as having 3 overlapping centers of religious focus: earth, magic, and deity. And I have played with, or earth, magic, and gods. I've played with the second of these, magic. At one point, we used the term self with a capital S, not meant to be insulting, but a focus on personal development being the focus of that group. So individual pagans can identify more or less with any one of these 3 centers and can fall anywhere in this kind of Venn diagram. Earth-centered paganism includes those forms of paganism that are concerned primarily with ecology, local forms of paganism, and various forms of neo-animism. Magic-centered paganism includes many Wiccans and witches. By no means all. You can be a Wiccan or a witch and fall closer to the Earth center. And but is generally for those people who are focused primarily on the development of their inner self. Deity-centered paganism includes devotional polytheism, which is a relatively new phenomenon in the last couple of decades, the various hard polytheisms, and reconstructionisms. Much of the work that was done writing and promoting the Pagan Community Statement on the Environment, and this was a process of self-selection, was done by pagans who identified as earth-centered, maybe not surprising, while much of the opposition to the statement came from pagans for whom magic, and especially the gods, are more central to their religiosity than the earth. So there are 2 beliefs within, there are 2 beliefs within, which are common among contemporary pagans, which can potentially, and please note that I'm emphasizing potentially here, act as distractions from the natural world. The first is a belief in practical or instrumental magic, the idea that we can cause change physical change at a distance without corresponding physical action. Seen in this way, magic can be seen as just another form of technology which contributes to the disenchantment of the world. Trudy Frisk has written in her essay, Paganism, Magic, and the Control of Nature, which was published in Trumpeter, that the instrumental view of magic perpetuates a utilitarian view of nature, expecting natural objects to fulfill human desires, leads to disregard for maintaining nature in all its complexity. Oops. She goes on, Paganism has an unparalleled opportunity to evolve spiritual ceremonies compatible with ecological knowledge, to create a new sense of sacredness to set against destruction. The message of humanist materialism is hollow. People yearn for something greater. Paganism, if it reconsiders magic, may be the faith of the future. The world urgently needs eco-centered, not ego-centered religions, blending reverence for nature with knowledge of its complexity. Paganism, if it treats magic as an expression of wonder and not a means of control, could be one of those religions. Fortunately, there are pagans who already have and are continuing to develop alternative non-instrumental conceptions of magic, from Starhawk's classic formulation of magic as the art of transforming consciousness, to more recently Julie Shutton and Richard Rogers in their paper Magic as an Alternative Symbolic Enacting Transhuman Dialogue, in which they describe magic as a way of communing with the more than human natural world. Another potential distraction is the belief in invisible supernatural beings, including literal gods, spirits, fairies, and so on. Without a visible and physical presence, these may function as distractions from the visible physical earth. Susan Greenwood states in her book, The Nature of Magic and Anthropology of Consciousness, a focus on inner nature and the ritual invocation of anthropomorphic deities appears to direct attention away from seeing nature as including other sentient beings. Nature can thus become an abstract force consisting of impersonal energies. Again, though, there are pagans who are and have developed and are developing alternative understandings of gods, such as the naturalistic polytheist Alison Lee Lilly and Stephen Posh, who I mentioned earlier, who invites us to make the, quote, radical leap out of our own internal dialogue. Make the radical leap out of our own internal dialogue and into actual relationship with real non-human others: sun, moon, earth, storm, sea, wind, fire, plants, and animals. I continue to identify as pagan because I believe paganism has the potential to re-enchant the world and to expand our consciousness of the radically interconnected nature of that world. The challenge for paganism moving forward will be to figure out how we regain the sense of magic without resorting to superstition, how to incorporate the wisdom of pre-scientific cultures without losing the rigor of the scientific method, how to restore a sense of life and even personhood to our experience of the world without projecting our own imaginings onto nature, and how to awaken to other modes of consciousness without regressing to psychological infantilism and wishful thinking. To conclude, I believe the use of terms like paganism and even gods and goddesses and even earth gods and earth goddesses needs to be interrogated closely by academics and participants alike to determine whether the cultural phenomena being described are truly earth-centered. And rather than thinking of paganism as a green religion or not, it's more accurate to think of the greening of paganism as a process which is never complete and always subject to critique. Thank you very much.